Today we're going to take a look at this stunningly beautiful concept car that you see here, the 1977 Pontiac Phantom, and talk more about its intriguing history, which begins with the man in the background of this photo. That is none other than General Motors design vice president and styling leader Bill Mitchell. Now, Mitchell was GM's design vice president and leader from 1959 when he took over from Harley Earl all the way through 1977, when it was responsible for so many great General Motors designs of the time frame. Of course, he had a talented staff of designers and sculptors and engineers, but Mitchell was the man at the top, and he put General Motors design at the top and kept it there for many years. Mitchell was responsible for so many beautiful designs, including the 1963 Stingray. Pretty much any General Motors car in the mid-1960s, it's hard to find a bad one. And he continued GM's design, let's say, forward thinking, even all the way through his final years in 1977 with the successful downsizing of the full-size cars. That led those vehicles to achieve Motor Trend's Car of the Year. And really, the last designs that Mitchell had a hand over were vehicles like the 1980 Cadillac Seville. That was kind of the punctuation mark on his design career. He was still the design chief during that time frame when it was being developed, although the car was designed in a studio that was led by a gentleman named Wayne Cady. But back to the Phantom, and this is a picture taken at the Sloan Museum in Flint, Michigan, which is where the Phantom resides today after it was saved from the crusher by designers who really recognized its historical significance and whisked it away to the Sloan Museum back in the 1970s after Bill Mitchell retired to ensure that it was preserved for posterity. So the car really started as a styling exercise that was not intended to showcase a future design direction for Pontiac. Instead, it was really intended to be a personal design statement from Mitchell and kind of an expression of what he loved most about car design. And during this time frame, Mitchell was just enamored with, I'll say, the classic vehicles of the 1930s, whether that was Cadillac V16s or the Bugattis of the era or Delahaye's or other vehicles like that. Kind of these four-fendered vehicles oftentimes that had beautiful styling, graceful styling, in some cases fastback designs. But that was his style, and he wanted a personal expression of that. We'll talk a little bit more about how the Pontiac piece came to being in a minute. But think of this car, again, not as something that was looking to the future of Pontiac design, but more of as a personal statement for Bill Mitchell. Now, the car was designed in a basement studio, a secret studio called Studio X at the General Motors Technical Center. That was effectively Bill Mitchell's personal studio where projects would be worked on that he really wanted kept out of the main studios. And a designer named Bill Davis was the one who really created the Phantom. Of course, it was overseen by Mitchell, as this would be a punctuation mark on his era at General Motors design. Now, looking at this car today, it's kind of hard to put it in historical context, but it's both futuristic and anachronistic at the same time. And what do I mean by that? Well, back in 1977, there really were not a lot of designs that were coming out that harkened back to the glory days, as I mentioned, of the 1930s. And we tend to think of like that retro period of car design in the 2000s, the early aught era of the 21st century, where you had the Ford Thunderbird that was revived. You have the Chrysler PT Cruiser, among other vehicles. But this car was kind of the original retro in terms of concepts. And of course, Bill Mitchell, starting in the early 1970s, and I would say really with the 1971 Eldorado in particular, started transitioning General Motors design from these very crisp and edgy and more futuristic looking cars back to a romantic era, if you will, of vehicles. And this 1977 Phantom is really the ultimate retro. But again, that was something that was not done back then. The concept of kind of a retro vehicle that looked back in history for inspiration for its design was really antithetical to what designers try to do, which is envision the future and look forward. But I think this car does so beautifully, as exemplified in this front view. Now, as we rotate around to the rear and take a look at this kind of rear three-quarter view, you can see what I mean about these historic touches. I mean, this car does still have that four-fendered look, similar to the 1971 Eldorado, but even more graceful here. Look at that piece of bright work that starts at the front of the car and then wraps around the side, then over top of the quarter panel, and then just tapers ever so beautifully to, well, I can't really call it a deck lid because this car is, we'll talk about in a second, isn't functional, but all the way to the rear of the car. That molding, I think, is just a piece of art unto itself. And of course, you have this fastback design that was really something that Bill Mitchell loved. All the way back to the 63 Stingray and as exemplified by the Boat Tail Riviera, he loved that kind of fastback shape that came to this point. And the Phantom here is another expression of that. I love even the exhaust tips that are red. Of course, if this were a running car, they would turn black relatively quickly, but that's not an issue here. What's amazing to me is how striking this design is, and that juxtaposition of modern as well as historical design, I think, is just perfection on this car. Some designers love it, some designers hate it, I have to say. Not just from today's time frame, but also including those who were in the General Motors design building back when this was being put together. Also notice, we'll take a close-up look at these in a second, these concentric ring wheel covers that also are a throwback to yesteryear and what was seen on some classic vehicles of the time. But you certainly get the classic proportions and an expression, as I mentioned, of what Bill Mitchell loved the best. As we rotate around to the dead-on rear view, this is one of my favorite views of the car because you can see how the glass panes and the overall, let's say, body is pulled in from the extreme edges of the quarter panel. And it accentuates the width of the car. Of course, it's not necessarily helping in the passenger compartment area. But from the dead-on rear, it just makes the car look extremely wide. And I love how everything here tapers. The body, kind of that upper section, just pulls inward as it comes rearward, of course, because of the fastback that's tapering as well to the, well, let's call it humorously thin bumper out back. You obviously could not produce this car during this time frame with the bumper standards being what they were. And even those quarters just kind of gently rising and then falling as they come rearward on the vehicle. Just fantastic. I also love how the license plate, or I guess the nameplate for the car, is under this piece of plexiglass, just like the tail lamps and the headlamps up front. So you don't really have any unbroken surfaces here. The surfaces are continuous and uninterrupted, although of course you do have some transparent elements associated with the surface. As we rotate around to the passenger side in this rear three-quarter view, we catch a couple humorous touches, and what do I mean by that? Well, you have what appears to be a fuel filler door there on the sail panel, but as I mentioned, this car is not a runner. It is just a rolling chassis. There's no engine here. In fact, the interior isn't even finished, as you're going to see in a second. And why is that? Well, Bill Mitchell actually had envisioned this being a personal car that he could take off into his retirement, kind of a memory of his time at General Motors Design and a gift to him by the company for all that he had done for his many years of service. That was at least his vision. But by this time, his boss was named Howard Carroll. And Howard Carroll was a very powerful General Motors executive who was in charge of all the technical staffs at the time. And let's just say that Howard Carroll and Bill Mitchell did not get along at all. And as a consequence, when Howard Carroll learned of Bill Mitchell's intention to kind of take this car into retirement, he put the kibosh on it and put a stop to it and cut all of the funding. And so that's one of the reasons why the car, as I mentioned, wasn't ever finished. Mitchell, I believe, originally envisioned this car as a Cadillac, but Cadillac reneged on the deal to really help fund the program for him. And Pontiac did donate some components, including the chassis from a Grand Prix. And so it became the Pontiac Phantom, although some people refer to it as the General Motors Phantom. So Bill Mitchell never really got what he desired out of this car, which was a full running driving vehicle that could be his own. kind of a, let's say, pompous move on his part to think that the company was going to custom build a car for him and let him take it into his retirement. I believe Harley Earl, his predecessor, had something like that. But the times had changed and just were different. And as I mentioned, Howard Carroll was definitely not going to let Mitchell do that. And perhaps that's one of the reasons as well why Bill Mitchell's successor, Irv Ribicki, was appointed versus Chuck Jordan. Both Irv and Chuck Jordan were competitors at the time, but Chuck Jordan was really, I'll say, made in the mold of Bill Mitchell, including little temper tantrums and various fits. Although he was a very talented designer, he certainly did not have a reputation as a team player, let's say, with the business and divisional management of the car divisions. And so Irv Ribicki, who was known much more as a team player, and also, let's say, a more mellow figure, for lack of a better term, was appointed the design vice president to succeed Mitchell, much to the surprise of many in the building at the time. Now, as we approach the side of the car, we notice another humorous touch, and that is those little cutouts where the window could allegedly drop down, but nothing is functional on this interior. They remind me of DeLorean little window slits because, well, you couldn't have the whole glass drop down into the door here because the glass plane is so curved and the door section just couldn't accommodate it. But that is a pretty humorous little opening that was designed in this case. Now, you do see a steering wheel. You do see an instrument panel with some very modern-esque touches with these very, very small vents as outlets that are integrated into the IP. And it kind of looks like you have a, I guess, early 90s Chevrolet Lumina steering wheel there. But this interior is not finished. There's no carpet. There's no console. There's kind of like half of a seat back in here. There's not even a bottom to the seats for the reasons that I mentioned. Once Howard Carroll got wind of this, he really cut funding for it. And it's unfortunate because this car, really, you can imagine it would have been great to be a vehicle that could run and drive like many concepts, but it has to be pushed around on a stand. And for that reason, it's not shown often because it's hard to move it. Although today it does have a customized stand to enable it to move around. I have to say, I do love that check in the belt line there that kind of mimics a Buick characteristic, but something that you also saw in a lot of classics, Darren-bodied cars, for an example. And again, this car is just a melange, just a beautiful melange of so many different styling elements in one. I think it's absolutely fantastic. One other up-close design detail I wanted to show here were these beautiful concentric ring wheel covers that perhaps came later on this car. This car went through a little bit of an evolution. I'll show a picture in the inset here where it appears to have wire wheels, and then there were some air or fake air extractor outlets behind the front wheel. But the design was cleaned up for this final version of the design. And you can see it has these red inner liners here. That was something that Mitchell loved, and a number of his cars had, even dating back to some of the Oldsmobile 442s, had plastic wheel liners that were red. And I think the way that he expressed it was that he wanted it almost to be like you cut open a piece of meat. You know, you could see the blood, if you will. But it also enabled one to see the sculpture within the inner fender here. So an interesting touch that you really don't see on cars today, but some General Motors vehicles, as I mentioned, back in the era had it, and something that Bill Mitchell was definitively fond of. And as we rotate back around to the front here, I did want to talk a little bit more about some design elements that I think are just beyond beautiful. Take a look at I'll call it a front bumper again, almost non-existent. But I love how it kind of curls up the front fender edge there and just tapers. This car, if you had to express in maybe one adjective, I would just say tapered and tailored. I guess that's two adjectives. But I love how that piece of bright work and the bumper just kind of creeps up the leading edge of the fender there and does so so delicately. Of course, you have the split windshield here and a little crease in the roof, similar to the Bugatti Atlantic, And by the way, for those who don't know, the Bugatti Atlantic was also the inspiration behind another retro concept from the 1990s. That is the Chrysler Atlantic, that was really designed in large part by Bob Lutz, I think on a napkin or something like that. But Tom Gale's design team obviously executed it. And that was one of the sensational concept cars of the 1990s. Again, another car that was very strange in that it looked backward as opposed to forward. But that was that time frame in the 90s and early aughts where designers and companies were looking back for inspiration for design. And I mentioned some of the vehicles that came out during that time frame that exemplified the retro design. And here you have one more photo up close of the driver's side, and a little bit hard again to see into the interior. It's kind of purposefully tinted to be dark because it is unfinished. But take a look at that toothpick A-pillar and how it has this beautiful fillet at the bottom of it and just transitions smoothly. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the 66 Tornado A-pillar and at the bottom there. So the car has all of these different styling elements, and again, was just meant as this personal expression for Bill Mitchell, but unfortunately was never finished. So as a consequence, I must ask, what do you think about this Pontiac Phantom? Is this something that would be something you would have bought back in the day, or is this something you would have passed on because it was just too retro? I think it's a beautiful expression of one man's taste in design, and I think it at least aligns with my taste. I would love to drive something like this today. It has so many just beautiful design cues from the past that are integrated in a form that is similar and yet different and a bit more modern and tailored and crisp. I think it's fantastic. But, oh well, Howard Carroll must not have, because as I mentioned, he decided to kill it. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Now, before I close, I have to say that this video is sponsored by Perdinos of Grosse Ile, fine dining on the island. And I don't take any paid advertisements or sponsorships. That's just one of the things that I don't do on this channel. So this is not a paid advertisement or sponsorship. Perdinos has been open for over 40 years on Grosse Ile, and I have known the owner of the restaurant for decades, all the way back to my high school years. And he, in fact, gave me a love for fine dining. I stopped in there yesterday, and it was just a reminder of how great it is. And you know what? I thought I would give him a plug because, after all, the owner really helped raise me for decades. So if you're around the area or you want to make a little trip, stop by Perdinos of Grosse Ile and tell him that Adam sent you. Thanks again for watching, and take care.